Hey my glam girls, welcome back to my channel. It's Chelsea, where we talk about all things glam and all things girly. I am a beauty enthusiast that loves to delve into everything surrounding beauty and makeup, but I also do like to switch it up and throw in a little bit of fashion and some vlogs. So if any of that sounds like it is of interest to you, I would love for you to consider subscribing and joining the Glam Girl Squad. And today we are finally discussing the ANASTASIA Primrose palette. So of course I'm going to be sharing with you how I created this eye look and my final thoughts on this palette. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I truly do appreciate it, and let's get right into this video. So like I said, we are discussing the new ANASTASIA Beverly Hills Primrose palette. And this is not a first impression completely. I've used the eyeshadows multiple times, but today was the first time that I did use the blushes. So we'll get into all of that. But in case you're not sure of what I'm talking about, here we have a look at the beautiful Primrose palette. And I'm just gonna say, when I first saw this palette, I said, yes, I need it because I know I'm gonna love it. That was it. Not even trying it, just thinking if the formula of their eyeshadows is the same as like their standard formula, I can get with this palette. I love the color scheme of this palette. It's just extremely pretty to me. That's like the first word that comes to my mind when I think of this palette. So this does retail for $55. We get a total of 12 shades in the palette. 10 of these shades are going to be geared toward eyeshadows, and then these two right here are going to be blushes. I initially thought that this was supposed to be a bronzer, but it's not a bronzer. It is a blush, and that's how they have it described on Sephora's website. So that's what I'm going with in this video. So they state that this palette is going to be a highly pigmented eyeshadow palette and face palette, and we get a mixture of matte shades and metallic shades. So let's get into some swatches. Starting off first with this shade called Saddle. This is going to be the first blush shade, and this is described as a matte terracotta shade. Very beautiful shade. Then we have the second blush shade. This is going to be described as a kind of like a coral pink shade. This is called Grapefruit. First eyeshadow is Mango. Then the shade Primrose, the name of the palette. This shade is a matte shade with some gold sparkles, like pink and gold sparkles. That's what it looks like to me. Sparkling Amber, a beautiful gold shade. Second matte eyeshadow, this is called Honey, a very beautiful tan shade. Rose Water, such a beautiful shimmer shade. And this shade has a bit of a duochrome shift to it. I see shades of gold and pink with almost like a champagne hue to it. Very, very pretty. Peony, beautiful pink gold type of shade. Rogue, very beautiful deep tan brown shade. Fire Opal, that is just stunning. That shade looks like fire. It really does. Going on the back side of my arm, we have Deep Berry. This is a very beautiful eggplant type of shade. And then lastly, Claret, or maybe Claret, not sure how you pronounce that. I would say this is a nice like purple burgundy mixture type of shade. So sorry for the weird angle, but I didn't feel like switching to another arm. So these are all of the shades in this particular palette. Very, very pigmented shades, as you can see. So getting into the eye look, I first wanted to start off with this shade called Mango. I previously had already gone and used the tan shade. So I've used before these two shades right here. So I really wanted to delve deep into these purple shades. So starting off with the shade Primrose, blended that into the transition area of the eye. And this shade, I thought it would have had a little bit more pigmentation, a little bit more color, but on my complexion, it remains very light. Like if I could say a very true transition shade for my complexion. So I wasn't too disappointed by this shade. I thought it was gonna have more pigment. I kept building it up and I was like, okay, this is about all I'm gonna get. So for me, this shade is just going to be a solid transition shade. Then I went in with the shade called either Claret or Claret, and I really concentrated that into the crease of the eye. I kind of wanted to create almost like a cut crease without doing a cut crease, so that was the hope of concentrating that color into the crease. This shade blended out really nicely. A little bit does go a very long way with these more pigmented types of colors. You don't need a lot, and you can easily use too much because they really blend well. So you can take a little bit of the eyeshadow and really blend it all across the eye if that's what you're trying to do. If you take too much, then you're gonna get too much pigmentation. And of course, if you've got too much pigmentation, it's gonna be harder to take that away versus using a little bit and building up from there. So for this whole entire palette, I would say go in with smaller amounts and then add accordingly. And that was actually what they suggested when I looked at the how to use tab on Sephora. They did suggest going in with small amounts and building up from there, and I can completely see why. After that shade, I wanted to use this deep berry shade in the outer portion of the eye, and this shade built up really nicely. I think it's very hard, from what I've heard, to formulate purple eyeshadows without them being too patchy, and I think this is a pretty solid purple. I definitely saw a little bit of patchiness when I was packing the shade on, but what I was happy about was I was able to build that color up and build it up with some opacity, and it wasn't streaky when I wanted to, you know, pack it on and build it up, so I was happy with that. So especially with this deep berry shade, I would definitely suggest working in small amounts and building up to your liking so that you don't have any type of patchiness with that shade. It's not a patchy shade, it's just, it's just a shade that's not going to, you know, be full on opaque without maybe having to go over it a couple times. Does that make sense what I'm trying to say? I hope it does. So then after that, I went into this shade called Primrose. And like I said, this shade is a matte shade, but it does have like some gold and pink reflex to it. And so that built up really nicely in the middle of the eye. And then for the inner corner, I did want to add a little razzle dazzle. So I went in with the shade called Peony and concentrated that in the inner portion of the eye, but then kind of like spread it all across the eye. I wanted to kind of create like almost like there's a flame going across the eye, not a literal flame, but you know, like when I think of a flame, it's highly concentrated in one portion of the flame and then it kind of like flares out. That was kind of how I imagined the shimmer on my eyes. If it didn't happen and you don't see it, it's okay. That's just what I was thinking when I applied the eyeshadow. Then for the lower lash line, I went back in with Deep Berry and just really concentrated that across the lower lash line. And then I took my brush that I already had used, this shade called Claret or Claret, didn't add any more shadow to it. I just took what was left on the brush and just blended out Deep Berry so that it wasn't so stark under the eye. But we did get a blend of what was remaining on the brush from Claret or Claret and that Deep Berry shade. And I really liked how that blended out. So for the inner corner and for the lower lash line, the inner portion of the lower lash line, I went in with Rose Water here, and I love this shade. It's so pigmented, and I would definitely say this shade right here does have more of like a metallic look to it. What I mean by that is Peony, for instance, when placed on the eye, didn't have as much fallout as it could have had, whereas Rose Water did have more of a little bit more fallout, and when I applied it to the lower lash line and the inner corner, I saw more of that metallic hue to it. So I would say that would be the difference between these two shades, but nothing that's gritty or like particles that you can feel on the eye. Nothing like that, but just, you know, small differences that I can see between these two shades. And that is how I created the eye look, and I love this eye look. I think it is dark and vampy and sexy, very fall appropriate. Looking at myself in the mirror, that's why I'm kind of off-centered, and I love it. This formula of eyeshadows truly reminds me of the standard Anastasia eyeshadows that we truly love and enjoy. And like I said, I knew I was gonna enjoy this palette and love it. if that formula was the same, and in my opinion, I really do think that formula is the same. The mattes, like I said, blend very beautifully, and these shimmer slash metallic shades are beautiful. Like I have used every one of the metallic shades, shimmer shades, and I have used now every one of the matte shades, and I think it's just a total winner. If this type of color story appeals to you and you love the colors, I really think that you would really enjoy this palette in terms of the eyeshadows. Now on to the blushes. Like I mentioned earlier, I thought this shade Saddle was supposed to be a bronzer, and I remember when this palette was announced, some people were upset because they were like, why would you call this a face palette? And the face portion of the palette is not going to work for a lot of complexions. But looking at these two shades as blush shades and not a bronzer and a blush, I think we can go a little bit further than what we initially thought. So I initially put Saddle on this portion of my face, and just like the eyeshadows, these blushes are highly pigmented. So if you wanted to build up the color of these shadows, I think you really can. I do think Saddle is going to definitely be a shade that's supposed to work for deeper complexions, but is Saddle gonna work with someone who has a very rich, deep complexion? Probably not. But I do think it's going to go further down the deeper spectrum of complexions versus if we thought this was supposed to be a bronzer. Does that make sense what I'm trying to say? And then with grapefruit, I used grapefruit on this side, and actually grapefruit showed up more on my skin than I thought it would. I thought this was gonna be more of like a dusty rose, and it showed up more than I thought it would. Now, am I saying that these are gonna be like two universal shades? They're not. I just think that these shades are gonna go a little bit further than what we might have initially thought when, if you were like me, you thought this was supposed to be a bronzer. I think they could have chosen maybe a different shade for the blush. Instead of having this grapefruit blush, maybe chosen a shade that was a little bit deeper, so that if you were of a deep complexion, you could use both of these as blushes. But if these two shades are not going to work for your complexion, whether you feel they are just too deep for your complexion or you feel they are too light for your complexion, you most definitely can use them as eyeshadows. So depending on what you're looking for and from this palette, I do think this palette could definitely work for a plethora of complexions. It's just how you want to use it and what you feel you will get your money's worth. If you're about my complexion and definitely a few shades deeper than me, then I do think you can use both of these blushes as blushes. And then these as eyeshadows. Of course, if you are of a lighter complexion than me, you might be able to use this as a bronzer, especially if like you prefer more of like an orangey hue type of a bronzer. Of course, you can use that shade as a blush. And then if you are of a richer complexion and you're like, you know what, I'm fine with this not being a face palette for me and this just being an eyeshadow palette, then once again, because of this deep berry, you do have a shade that you could maybe smoke out the look with, and then any of these shimmers will show up on a deeper complexion. So all in all, I do recommend this palette. I think it's really, really nice. Like I said, for me, I knew that I was gonna love this palette just because I enjoy the color story, and these are like my tones of eyeshadow, and the formula is amazing. It is amazing. I don't think this is what I would call a need palette, like, oh my gosh, drop whatever you're doing and go get it now. But I do think this palette would be amazing if you picked it up during the upcoming Sephora sale, or if you wanted to gift it to somebody who you think would truly appreciate these tones and this formula, because it's a really, really beautiful palette, and I'm very happy with it. So I hope that you enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts on the palette. Are you gonna pick it up, or do you already have it? What are your thoughts? What do you think of the eye look? And if you've made it to this point in the video and you have yet to subscribe to my channel, I would love for you to consider subscribing and joining the Glam Girl Squad. And guys, that is it. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope to see you in my very next video. Bye guys.